All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this Executive Threat Briefing Explainer. Today, we're taking a hard look at a vulnerability that has literally cost the global economy billions of dollars. And yet, crazily enough, it still often gets written off as just a simple technical glitch. I'm talking about SQL injection. But listen, I don't want to frame this as an IT headache today. I want to frame this as what it truly is, a critical business risk that directly threatens your bottom line, your intellectual property, and for sure, your brand's reputation. We're going to break down exactly how this attack works, why our standard everyday defenses might actually be failing us, and most importantly, what we need to do right now to secure the enterprise.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. Number 1, the cost of data breaches. 2, anatomy of SQL injection. 3, the Excelian attack case study. 4, beyond basic input validation. 5, layered defenses and WAFs. And finally, 6, data-centric database security.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the cost of data breaches. I want to start by challenging a pretty common assumption we make. Are our enterprise databases truly secure from unauthorized access? Often when we're sitting around in the boardroom, we look at the sheer amount of money we spend on perimeter security, and we just kind of assume, well, the vault is locked. But as we're going to see today, attackers really aren't breaking down the vault door anymore. Nope. They're actually convincing the system itself to just hand over the keys.
And this illustrates exactly what happens when that metaphorical vault is opened up. Just look at the massive scale and the devastating long-term business impact of these historic breaches. Target, they saw over 40 million customers exposed. Yahoo had an absolutely astonishing 3 billion user accounts breached due to custom software flaws. That's nearly half the planet. And LinkedIn had over 167 million hashed passwords stolen specifically through a system SQL injection. So these aren't just minor technical failures. They resulted in massive financial losses, brutal regulatory fines, and honestly, a catastrophic loss of customer trust.
Moving on to Section 2, anatomy of SQL injection.
So the absolutely crucial starting point here is understanding what SQL injection, or SQLi, actually is. Put simply, it's a cyber attack that inserts malicious SQL code into a web application's input fields, all to manipulate the backend database. Think of it like this. Instead of using brute force to smash down a bank vault door, an attacker just casually walks up to the bank teller, slips them a maliciously worded note, and tricks that teller into walking to the vault and bringing the money right out to them. The system's own logic is quite literally turned against it.
To properly defend against this, you really have to think like an attacker. Consider the fundamental training that our internal security teams go through. They learn exactly how hackers abuse SQL wildcard symbols. You see, in standard SQL queries, a percent sign represents 0 or more characters, and an underscore represents a single character. While these are originally meant for completely legitimate search functions, attackers can inject these wildcards to quietly map out hidden database structures or even bypass basic security filters entirely. It is a completely foundational concept for our defense teams to understand.
Now, hackers generally use a few distinct methods to actually extract your data. First up, we have in-band SQI. This one is noisy. The attacker uses the exact same communication channel to launch the attack and gather their results. They often use what's called union-based techniques to merge their malicious queries with your legitimate ones. Or they'll use error-based techniques to literally force your database to reveal its structure through error messages. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there's inferential or blind SQI. This is silent. It's like blind lockpicking. The attacker asks the database true or false questions, or they force the database to wait a few seconds before responding, which is a time-based attack. This lets them slowly, quietly deduce the data without triggering any obvious alarms. And finally, there's out-of-band SQI. Here, the attacker forces the server to send data out through a completely different channel, like a DNS request. Let's actually walk step by step through how this builds into a classic authentication bypass. Imagine a standard login screen. The attacker doesn't know the password, obviously. So, step 1. In the username field, they input quote, or, quote, 1, quote, equals quote 1. Step 2. A poorly designed system takes that and directly concatenates it into the backend query. It literally asks the database to check if the username is admin or if 1 equals 1. Well, step 3, because 1 always equals 1, the entire statement evaluates as true. The database is completely tricked into granting full authentication bypass. Boom. The attacker just walked right into the admin panel without a password.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Excelian attack case study.
The Excelian attack is a real-world masterclass in how attackers string vulnerabilities together. It wasn't just a simple database read. Look at this timeline. In hour 1,
The attackers used SQL Injection to retrieve encryption keys right from the database. In Hour 2, they took those keys to generate valid access tokens. Hour 3 is where the real nightmare begins, folks. They used their new elevated access to exploit an operating system command execution flaw, meaning they escalated from simply reading a database to running their own arbitrary commands on the underlying server itself. By Hour 4, they had deployed a custom web shell named do-mode to systematically extract files and exfiltrate highly sensitive data.
And because the Excelian file transfer appliance was so widely used for moving large, sensitive files globally, this spiraled into a massive supply chain attack. The global targets that were compromised included the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the state of Washington, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, Singtel, and even a major security software maker, Qualys. This really underscores a terrifying universal risk. If these top-tier financial and governmental institutions are vulnerable to these supply chain exploits, well, so are we.
All right, Section 4, Beyond Basic Input Validation. I want to highlight this specific reality for a second. While input validation, like checking if a user's input matches an expected email format, should absolutely always be considered a best practice, it is rarely a foolproof solution. Why? Because if you try to sit there and map out every single legal and illegal input imaginable, you just end up over-filtering, and that causes infuriating false positives that block your real customers and disrupt your legitimate business operations. Relying on basic validation alone is a losing battle.
Instead, here is a quick mini tutorial on what actually works for safe sanitization. Step 1. Developers absolutely must stop dynamic string concatenation. Never, ever glue user input directly into SQL code. Step 2. Implement parameterized queries, which are also known as prepared statements. This is huge. It forces the database to treat user input strictly as plain data, not as executable SQL code. So even if an attacker types in a malicious command, the database just shrugs and reads it as a harmless string of text. Step 3. Enforce least privilege. Ensure that the web application only has the absolute minimum database permissions required to function. Definitely don't use admin accounts for your routine web queries. And the impact of doing this correctly? It is massive. Industry data actually shows that properly configured stored procedures and parameterized queries can lower your SQL injection risks by as much as 90%. 90%. It is, without a doubt, the single most effective structural defense we can implement right at the code level.
Moving on to Section 5, Layered Defenses and WAFs. So think of a web application firewall, or WAF, as your ultimate digital gatekeeper. It sits right in front of your applications and analyzes all incoming web traffic in real time. It actively filters out those malicious SQL queries before they ever get a chance to reach your backend database. It does this by using signature-based detection for known attack patterns and anomaly-based detection to spot any weird behavioral deviations. Plus, if a brand new vulnerability drops, a WAF can actually provide immediate virtual patching that blocks the exploits while our developers work on a permanent code fix behind the scenes.
But hey, we can't just set up a WAF and forget about it, right? We have to continuously test our defenses by integrating automated security tools like OWASP, ZAP, and Burp Suite directly into our continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. These tools systematically scan for vulnerabilities by actively throwing test payloads, like those wildcard symbols we talked about earlier, right at our applications. Step 1, the tool identifies the suspicious query containing the injected wildcard. Step 2, the CI/CD pipeline automatically blocks the deployment entirely. It catches the vulnerability before it ever reaches production.
And finally, Section 6, Data-Centric Database Security. Look, even with perfect code and a top-tier WAF, we have to assume a breach is still possible. That is exactly why data-centric security layers are so incredibly vital. You need to discover and classify exactly where your sensitive data lives. Then, you actively monitor data access behavior at the database level itself. If a compromised internal account suddenly tries to download an entire user table, or if a silent inferential SQL attack starts slowly extracting data row by row, real-time database monitoring and intrusion detection systems will catch those unauthorized read/write attempts and shut them down immediately.
So I want to leave you with this one final provocative thought to take back to your teams today. Can our current real-time monitoring detect a silent, blind SQL injection before the data is actually exfiltrated and it becomes a massive boardroom crisis? The cost of data breaches is simply way too high to rely on assumptions anymore. We need parameterized queries, we absolutely need layered WAF defenses, and we need data-centric monitoring. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly urge you to evaluate your current investments and take immediate strategic action today.